Governor, thanks for taking the time this afternoon. At your press conference last evening, you indicated that you've been negotiating with some of the Senate Democrats. Now, I want to ask, are these negotiations one-on-one? In other words, have you been on the phone with individual senators, or are these through staff?
We ultimately started out a week ago empowering the Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald to be reaching out to what I would call a core group of some of the more reasonable members of the state Senate. Since the stakes kind of went up this last week, I empowered members of my administration to reach out and to join in those discussions. I've made along the way some personal contacts with at least one of the state senators, but we really left the negotiations or the discussions up to members of my administration as well as Senator Fitzgerald. And up until now, I think, and I still think, hold out hope that they're going to finish off well. You know, we've had this week in particular, almost on a daily basis, a sense that we got to a point where at least some of them were willing to come home. I think what happens is they go back to talk to the rest of their caucus, and after 2 weeks, there's, I don't know the majority, but at least some in that caucus who were willing to stay out longer, be it 2 months, or in some cases I think there's even a few that might stay out 2 years if they could. And so it's very frustrating, not only for us, but I think it's frustrating for those, that group that I call the reasonable senators who want to come back, who want to find a pathway home. And I'm still holding out hope that if not convincing all 14, they can at least convince a group to come back.
Senator Fitzgerald had indicated earlier this week that he was under the impression that, I guess it would have been Wednesday morning, 4 or 5 of the Democrats were going to show up. They didn't. Were you under that same impression?
Yeah, we've heard that time and time again. We even thought there was something reached in the last couple of days or so. And we have, just so it's clear, in addition to the changes we approved after the Joint Finance Committee hearing, so I always like to point out when people say you've made no changes, no concessions, no negotiations. We did make changes. But beyond that, we put on the table, I think, some very legitimate proposal in terms of some modifications that could be made now or in the budget process. Again, I'm not going to go into the specific details just because these discussions are ongoing and I don't want to jeopardize those. But we've had, I think, a pretty genuine interest from these group of senators. The problem is they think they've got a pathway home, and then they go back to the caucus, and at least a few of them try to block it.
Collective bargaining remains off the table, though.
Yeah, for us, what I've said, and I think it's even more important after people saw the budget bill itself on Tuesday, is that I'm not willing to sell out the local governments. What I mean by that is it's become abundantly clear that for the amount of reduction in state aid that local governments are going to get, and we're not unlike nearly every other state across the country. What makes us different in this budget and budget repair bill discussion is that unlike New York and California and Texas and all these other states who are cutting billions of dollars from their schools and local governments, we're making those same sorts of cuts, but our argument is we're giving through the budget repair bill the tools for those local governments to achieve savings that exceed the reductions. If you don't make these changes, if you don't give them the tools with collective bargaining reform, they can't achieve those.
Some local school districts, municipalities have countered that in their particular cases, though, the cuts will not be matched by the savings that they could realize.
Well, in those cases, I think they're going to need to look more closely at the budget repair bill and the budget bill itself, because the important thing to remember for local governments is we've talked about the 5 and the 12%. That's the model for the state. Local governments are given the flexibility, particularly with health care, that if they needed to go beyond the 12.6%, they could. So, for example, if to make up in a district where they've got an unusual circumstance, to make up slightly more, they might go to 13 or 14%. Even in that case, though, you're still talking about less, considerably less than what taxpayers outside of government are paying in the states for health care. And you're even, from a government standpoint, talking about half of what the average federal government worker pays. So in any case, even with a 14% versus a 12%, it's a much better deal than what nearly everybody else is paying.
The modification to collective bargaining doesn't include salaries. And I wanted to ask you something about teachers in individual school districts. Yeah. When it comes to salary increases, those would be put to local referendums for teacher pay increases tied to the cost of living, the consumer price index.
CPI, right, sure.
I've reported on enough building referendums to know that these can be extremely divisive. How wise do you think it is, how prudent is it to insert that sort of issue into local politics. There's a potential there to really be pitting neighbor against neighbor, family member against family member, and something that could be very difficult to work through.
Well, we put the CPI in because we really wanted to adjust it to a community's ability to pay. The referendum was added on as a component to say, if you needed to, how could you go beyond that? But really, realistically, think about it. The CPI right now is essentially flat because the economy's flat. So people in a local jurisdiction right now, the majority of people they aren't getting a pay raise because the economy's flat. In many cases, they're taking a pay freeze or taking a pay cut to keep their jobs outside of government. If the economy improves, which I would say not if, I believe it will improve in the next year or so. As it improves, just like it improved in the 90s after Tommy Thompson put in place some bold reforms and turned the economy around, as the economy improves here in the state of Wisconsin, the economy, say next year, might go up 3-4% or more. Well, then the CPI goes up 3-4%. That means in times when there's economic progress, our local government employees as well as our state employees can share in that success. That means they can negotiate for a base salary that goes up by the CPI. In times like we're in right now, where none of us are seeing any sort of growth in the economy, and then they wouldn't see a pay increase. But I think that's appropriate. Most people would say, hey, when times are good, our public employees should be compensated a little bit more. When times are tough like they are right now, we need to keep them intact.